I'm Joe Blevins. I'm on the faculty in the department and work in various aspects of global health practice. But in that practice, I work a lot at the intersection of public health research and science, public health practice, and religion. I have been at Rollins since 2009 as part of the Interfaith Health Program, an initiative that started first at the Carter Center and now at Rollins to understand how religious beliefs and behaviors influence health-seeking behaviors and health practices. And I've been director of the Interfaith Health Program since 2015. I'm going to be speaking today on
Have some ibuprofen.
United States and how that landscape intersects with and influences the current political climate that we face, and to think about the
Of course.
funding and priorities.
Never know when you're going to need it, so. Yep. Yeah. I need to start carrying Tums. I used to always have a little thing of Tums, but I
can't see the P that. Hang on just a second. I'm gonna mute. Yeah. Sorry, we're having people having some Great. Okay. Sorry about that. Just a little technical glitch for a moment. Today I want to talk about and to summarize for you some data from various sociological research studies and in organizations on the social cultural shifts in the religious makeup of the United States to describe the impact of some of those shifts, specifically in relation to the rise of Christian nationalism, are really, it's like new phenomenon that has gained significant strength in the past 3 or 4 years and is growing at a very rapid rate. To situate that specific movement of Christian nationalism within the broader social and religious history of the United States, especially as that history intersects and relates to public health and local health, and finally to discuss the implications of Christian nationalism on public health programs and policies in the current administration. So let me start by just kind of laying out in terms of our demographics and shifts in demographics within the United States on what our religious landscape looks like. This data from Gallup. The blue line here represents the overall numerical percentage of Protestants within the United States, and you'll see an ongoing gradual decline since the late 1940s up until the early 2020s. The black line is Catholicism, which has remained really quite consistent in the same time period. The thing that gets the attention of lots of sociologists and lots of discussion in popular media today is the people represented by this purple line that was for a number of years quite low and then has risen in the early decades of the 21st century and now is at the same percentage as the number of Roman Catholics. And that is what Gallup calls the undesignated. I'll talk about it a lot as the unaffiliated or the nuns. We need to break down that overall blue line, though, because there is tremendous variation in the religious beliefs, the political stances, and the political participation, and what that participation looks like among American Protestants. That blue line represents a very wide and diverse and divergent set of religious beliefs and kind of cultural dynamics. So this is data from the Public Religion Research Institute showing in the religious makeup of the country, first in 2020 and then in 2023. And you're not going to see significant changes, although you are going to see some increase in the number of people who are unaffiliated. Starting at about 1 o'clock, this is the percentage of Americans who identify as white and evangelical. The next group is the percentage of Americans who identify as white and mainline Protestant. Mainline Protestant represents historically more liberal religious traditions within American Protestantism, such as the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, and other United Church of Christ, the Congregational Church, traditions that have long historical roots in the country And in the fundamentalist versions of the early decades of the 20th century, were the religious movements within Protestantism that emerged on the side in support of modernism and modernist perspectives in the country. The next slice of the pie is the percentage of white Catholics. In Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, other Christian groups, other religious traditions, and then finally the percentage of those who were unaffiliated. And right at the top of the pie is those who didn't respond in the survey. So a high response rate. And what you see here is a fairly stable picture in this short 3-year period, but a 4% growth in the percentage of Americans who identify as unaffiliated or none. Those numbers become even more striking in relation to age cohorts. So, sorry here, that should be 18 to 29, not 18 to 19. All right, what you see among those who are Americans 18 to 29, beginning in 2020, and then the second graph is 2023, is low numbers of white evangelical Protestants, quite mainline Protestants, and other religious traditions, and 36% of those in the 18 to 29 cohort in 2020 identifying as unaffiliated or nuns. And an inverse correlation between what those various kind of breakdowns look like for those in the 18 to 29 cohort versus those in the 65 plus cohort. You have a fourfold higher percentage of those 65 and older who identify as the evangelical Protestant, almost twice as many who identify as mainline Protestant, 65 and older, higher percentage rates for most religious groups, with the exception of some ethnic minorities, Hispanic Protestants, who represent just a smaller proportion of the United States population in general, especially among older adults, and a much smaller percentage of those who said they have no religious affiliation. And those numbers shift a little bit, but they look consistent between 2020 and 2023 in regard to a pattern and a movement we've seen emerge in the United States in the past decade or so. And so that's led sociologists and pundits and popular media to talk about the rise of the nones, those who articulate no organized interest in or participation in a religious tradition or a local religious community. This is data from Pew, from the Pew Research Center, their 2022 study modeling the future of religion in American life, indicating that as of 2020, 64% of the country identified as Christian, and by 2070, according to 4 different modelings that they carried out with the data, that number would continue to drop a fair bit from 54 to a very precipitous drop of only 35%. And regardless of the scenarios, we're looking at a case by 2070 in which less than half the country, or right at half the country, will identify as Christian, which is a marked shift from a century before, when 90% of the country identified as Christian. The scenarios, the steady switching scenario, it assumes that the current rates of switching that have taken place in the last generation will continue in subsequent generations, which would be that 31% of those who identify as Christian at birth or in their childhood become religiously unaffiliated by the time they turn 30, and 21% of those who are unaffiliated become adherents to and participating in the Christian tradition or faith. They also laid out scenarios where it rises at a higher rate, although the percentage of Christians who leave the faith within any generation is capped at no more than 50%. Under that scenario, we would drop to 39% of the country identifying as Christian. Scenario 3, there's no limitation or cap on those who might switch, and it's just following a trend line with an assumptive in the modeling that it would continue in a continuous upward trajectory. That would get us to 35%. And then the final scenario is that things basically say solid state, and they remain as they are now, with the number moving out of Christianity equal to the number moving into Christianity, at which point, because of the aging of the population, 54% of the population as a whole would identify as Christian by 27. We can see these numbers across various branches of Christianity and other religious traditions when we look at data from the Public Religion Research Institute. And what you can see here is the percentage of each religious group that were affiliated with that tradition during their childhood, the percentage that have entered that group during adulthood, the percentage that have left that group during adulthood, and then the difference between this number, the difference between these two added to this number leads to the current affiliation and then a net gain or loss. And we see among white mainline evangelical, non-evangelical Protestants, liberal progressive mainline Protestants, a tremendous drop in the number or the percentage of adherents within that tradition, of a 4.4% drop across generations. And that's marked by 3.4% entering and 7.8% leaving. We see a smaller drop among Black Protestants. We see a little bit of a rise among Hispanic Protestants. And then we also see a very marked drop among Catholics. White Catholics dropping across this generation by 6% and Hispanic Catholics by 3.5%. Because we're seeing a new sociological phenomenon emerge of those who identify no religious affiliation, we see this tremendous rise in the percentage of Americans who have no affiliation at 26% in the country versus in the previous generation, 10% of the country, or 10.4, a net gain of 15.6. So we see this remarkable and rapid rise sociologically in a large percentage of Americans who have no religious affiliation and don't articulate either a historical one or a present one. But there is emerging data that is leading us to think that this movement may have stalled or plateaued. This is from 2024 in the Pew Research Center that indicates over the past 4 years, the percentage of those who identify with no affiliation has largely stalled and has actually dropped over those periods by 3 percentage points from 2022 to 2023, from 31 to 28%. That data is backed up by data from Gallup, which shows over the past 5 years from a study in 2021, from 2017 to 2021, the percentage of those who had no religious affiliation remaining largely steady state at about 21%.
Just to confirm, this is all religions now, right? This includes...
Yep.
These data are all religions.
It's across all religions. But the percentage of Americans who identify as a different religious tradition has stayed pretty consistent.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So we are seeing numerical rises in other religious traditions, but they're rising largely at the rate of the population as a whole. What we're seeing is a drop in the raw numbers of some Christian groups and a drop in the percentage of the population that identifies as Christian. But this is across all religious traditions. So if these data have stalled, then what question to begin to think about is what's going on here? If we're seeing this tremendous drop generationally among white mainline evangelical Protestants, among white Catholics, among Hispanic Catholics, and we see this overall rise across the generation, what's driving the stalling if these existing religious traditions have indeed lost percentages of members and in some instances have actually lost number of overall adherents? Why are the nuns starting to stall and plateau if these established religious traditions are losing members? I want to use a quick case study, and I don't talk about this long, but quickly to talk about the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant body in the United States and is a good representative of American evangelicalism in general. This is a headline for Christianity Today, a news magazine covering evangelical Christianity in the United States. This is from 2023, noting that the data from the denomination shows that Southern Baptists lost about 500,000 members in 2023. In 2024, that number dropped again by about 242,000 members. Those are very steep drops and represent a fundamental shift. But if these numbers are dropping, why is this overall number of white evangelical Protestants actually gaining a little bit, where you see the largest body among evangelicals kind of falling off a cliff in some ways? And then this is just from today. This is from the New York Times this morning. The headline, Christianity's decline in the U.S. appears to have halted, a major study shows. Young people contribute to the shift. Quote, if you're a young white male these days and you think of yourself as conservative, then being religious is part of that. I think what we're seeing emerging around these numerical data and the sociological demographics is a churn within evangelicalism itself. And some earlier studies actually pointed to and anticipated this. This is from almost a decade ago, back in 2016, by a sociologist named Keegan Grant. It's just a blog post where he looked at the general social survey data, longitudinal data in the United States, and it was entitled, Where Does Southern Baptists Go When They Leave? The answer in one chart. And so in this chart, you see religious affiliation among Americans at the age of 16 during mid-adolescence, and religious affiliation in adulthood today. So this is asking people to think retrospectively back to the time when they were 15. What we see here is about 40% of Southern Baptists that were part of that tradition when they were in their adolescence have left it. And they go to lots and lots and lots of different places. Conversely, you see a cohort of people from various religious traditions or no religious tradition at all entering into the Southern Baptist Convention, where the outflow is higher than the in-migration. And where's that outflow occurring? Well, in terms of people who left the tradition and went into another Baptist tradition or came in from another Baptist tradition, it's about equal. For Methodists, this is good news for United Methodists. The number of Methodists who entered into Southern Baptist life is actually a bit smaller than the number of Methodists who left the Southern Baptist Church and are Methodists today. Similarly, for mainline Protestants, the number of mainline Protestants who enter into the Southern Baptist denomination is lower than the number who leave the Southern Baptist denomination and become mainline Protestants. There are a few more Catholics who enter in than Southern Baptists who leave and become Catholics, and a different religious tradition is very small for both, although more for leaving the Southern Baptist Convention. The two I'm most interested in, though, are these two. The roll numbers of people who are part of another evangelical tradition and become Southern Baptists is only about half of the percentage of those Southern Baptists who leave that denomination and become part of another evangelical tradition. And that percentage is about twice that of those who leave the Southern Baptist Convention and express no religious tradition. So Southern Baptists, by and large, are not becoming nuns in a great percentage order. They're becoming adherents, in terms of their largest cohort, of another evangelical tradition. And I think what we're seeing here is the emergence of a new religious movement grounded in American evangelicalism, expressed and described as Christian nationalism. And it has certain kinds of characteristics. That numerical growth among Christian nationalism is overwhelmingly driven by men. The percentage we see in numerical data from this past year, that for the first time since we've been looking at this data longitudinally in the middle part of the 20th century, that religious affiliation is actually higher among men than it is among women in the United States today, especially for Gen Z and younger generations. The Christian nationalist movement, by its very name, has an explicit goal to ground American law and policy in Christian doctrine. And of course, it's their understanding of what that Christian doctrine is. An assumption that being a Christian is a condition of being a good, or at least of being an American, or at least a good American. A religious movement that's characterized by very strict and rigid religious doctrines and beliefs, by a certain kind of doctrinal fundamentalism and the narrowest interpretation of holy text, in this instance, the Bible, that those texts have no error within them, and the interpretive framework for understanding those texts is grounded in that assumption. A number of people within the Christian nationalist movement are part of this tradition for the first time in their lives and being part of any religious tradition. So they're entering into a religious tradition for the first time, and this is the one they're entering in at a deep alignment with and affiliation with a reading of the Christian texts, the sacred text, the Bible, to read it as providing a prophetic anticipation of the end of history with Jesus's return, and a battle between the forces of God, with Jesus leading it, and the forces of evil, with Satan leading that battle. And that will be an actual historical event that will occur, and that it will occur very soon among the adherents of this religious tradition. So beginning in 2022, the Public Religion Research Institute began to look for ways to measure Christian nationalism in its annual surveys. And they do so by asking these 5 questions. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. U.S. law should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American, and God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Respondents' answers to these 5 questions are recorded and scaled on a scale of 0 to 1 and broken down into 4 categories. Adherents are those who score from 0.9 to 1. Sympathizers are those who score for 0.75 to 0.9. Skeptics are those who score from 0.51 to 0.74. And rejectors are those, skeptics are those who score from 0.1 to 0.5. Sympathizers are those who are from 0.5 to 0.75. Adherents are those who are from 0.75 to 1. And rejectors are those who reject all five statements. And you see, and we've only got data for 3 years here, but you see a pretty good consistency in terms of the percentage of Americans who articulate a religious, an agreement with these 5 statements or principles, or some percentage of these 5 statements. Most Americans reject them, at least half of them or more, and a significant percentage, 29%, reject all 5 of them. So the percentage of the American public that agrees with all of those statements is very low, and the percentage that agrees with more than half of them is also quite low. But there are stark differences in regard to religious identification. Among white evangelical Protestants, the number of those who are adherents who believe in those 5 statements is 30%, and the number who believe and at least have a scale scoring of 0.75 on a 1.0 scale, 0 to 1 scale, is 35%. So 2/3 of American evangelicals believe those 5 statements. Those numbers drop quite quickly across different religious groups. Hispanic Protestants coming in second, Black Protestants coming in third, and then dropping off with other religious traditions. We also see a sharp distinction according to a political affiliation. In 2024, over half of identified Republicans were either adherents to or sympathizers with those 5 statements. 53% of American Republicans either adhere to those 5 statements and are seeking to enact them, or sympathize with those 5 statements in regard to efforts to try to have them influence American public life. Independents are at a much lower rate, and Democrats at a rate even below that, with only 16% identifying as adherents or sympathizers. The Christian nationalism movement is small, but it is organizing. It's setting priorities, It's creating organizational structures through its own nonprofit status and nonprofit networks at state and local levels. It's creating an emergent church structure, or it's tying into an emergent religious movement that has its own congregational and church structure known as New Apostolic Reformation. And it's forming political action committees, the largest of which is known as ZICLAG, which raised about $250 million in the 2024 presidential campaign. It's establishing policy objectives and priorities, and they package these in a variety of digestible websites and materials as the Seven Mountain Mandate, with a vision to mold these seven spheres, what they call the mountains of society, to follow what the movement understands to be biblical mandates as they interpret those mandates. And those seven mandates are that biblical principles would form the basis for education in the United States, for the entertainment industry and popular culture, for the basis of the American family, for business organizations and the opportunities of business, of religious movements within the country, of the media and the media infrastructure in the country and within the government. And the New Apostolic Reformation is working to enact programs and policies across all seven of these spheres. Religion News Service reported in May 2024 that the movement now has outsized influence in American evangelicalism. PRRI counts that at 65% and counts evangelical leaders among its senior ranked. Religion Dispatches, which is a website offering journalistic and peer-reviewed writing in relation to religion in American Today, and the American News Monthly, The Atlantic, chronicled the influence of the movement on Get Out the Vote efforts that were estimated to have shifted urban counties and some battleground states to Trump by 2 to 3 percentage points. And Paul Diupe, a leading scholar in religion and politics who teaches at Duquesne and is the former editor of the journal Politics and Religion, is working currently to try to develop indicators for measuring the influence of New Apostolic Reformation movements in longitudinal survey and social scientific and political kind of survey platforms. His own research indicates that 41% of American Christians of any stripe, Protestant, Catholic, now know of and support the implementation of the Seven Mountains Mandate. And that grew from 2023 to 2024 by 9%. This is rapidly rising among American religious circles and ranks.
First, you're going to get to this, but where's the money coming from? I'm always going to ask about.
I don't know exactly. I mean, you've got for ZICLAG, a lot of what's funding ZICLAG, which is their political action committee, is coming out of the places that you would expect, like the owners of Hop Lobby.
Yeah.
Through donations of individuals in the congregations. New Apostolic Reformation congregations are worshiping communities that are all around the country. I don't know if they're in all 50 states. I'd have to check that. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the money trail is. Good question. But I didn't look at that for this.
I'll look at it.
The movement is still in the minority, but it's gaining adherent and social and political force. Mike Pence has spoken at a number of NAR events. In the 2024 campaign, Elon Musk appeared sometimes on his own and sometimes with candidate Trump at NAR congregations across battleground states, especially in Pennsylvania, where the movement has had a lot of success in establishing footholds. That says Paula, it should be Paula. Paula White Cain, who is has been an early leader of New Apostolic Reformation, has emerged as one of the most influential religious representatives in the administration, and she manages the White House Faith Office. So she sits in the White House managing the administration's relationship to religious organizations, and she is an early architect of the infrastructure for the New Apostolic Reformation movement. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, has worked in leadership roles with various NAR legal organizations for a number of years, although he retains membership as a Southern Baptist. And the principles and priorities of the Seven Mountains model inform much of the content of Project 2025. What is Christian nationalism doing in relation to public health programs and policies? To be honest, public health as a movement isn't so much on their radar. Health and medicine in the context of provision of clinical services is, not surprisingly, in the area of sexual and reproductive health. There are numerous instances in which this movement has had an outsized influence in efforts to overturn access to elective abortion at national levels and various state levels. If you need those sources, I can get them for you. But it's not just in, there's a typo here. That too should be a superscript in there. But it's not just in relation to abortion, in relation to contraceptive technologies. You see lay leaders such as Karen Swallow Pryor articulating and making the case again and again that birth contraception and the birth control pill functions as an abortifacient, and using the same logic of the immorality of elective abortion, calling for making contraception, the birth control pill, and IUDs illegal. And in regard to reproductive technologies, we see leaders within the movement organizing to challenge access to assisted reproductive technologies, such as in vitro fertilization. The Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, who ruled against in vitro fertilization, is a leader in the legal movement, the legal arm of NAR. In regard to PEPFAR, Kamiya Kaoma, who is an African religious studies scholar at Rice University and is part of the research team of the International Religious Health Assets Program, a research body that was co-founded here at Emory along with the University of Cape Town, has demonstrated that leaders within NAR had used the PEPFAR platform to advance anti-homosexuality bills, some of which have become law in a variety of countries across the African continent, and especially in the sub-Saharan region. And in 2023, as PEPFAR was up for reauthorization, there was big pushback among Roman Catholics against reauthorization of PEPFAR, but among American Protestants who were calling for PEPFAR not to be reauthorized, the NAR movement had a leadership role in organizing and coalescing those perspectives and leading to advocacy to elected officials who voted against reauthorization. In regard to USAID, there have been studies as early as the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that the missionary movements of New Apostolic Reformation active in Haiti at the time urged evangelical congregations in the country to refuse USAID funds as contrary to their religious tradition and their religious commitments that God would take care of them in the midst of disaster. And it was both sinful and dangerous to rely on government to do so. And in regard to COVID, our response to COVID, both in terms of prevention efforts and in regard to vaccines, and in what the kind of COVID response put in place in regard to broader public health movements moving forward, we see some of the most strident religious voices against vaccine coming out of the New Apostolic Reformation movement, with some leaders attributing a vaccine mark, like a smallpox scar, as the mark of the beast referenced in the Christian Bible in the book of Revelation, and advocating against prevention efforts such as social distancing, wearing of masks as contrary to religious freedom, and placing importance in efforts of human beings over and against God's capacity to protect us. And those are the citations for those various pieces. If you'd like to see these citations more in depth, I can send you this power. And so from my perspective, this religious movement is dangerous in lots of ways in its relationship both to public health and its relation to the civil society and political space in our country. It's also a driver of some of the things we're seeing happening in real time right now in the country. And so how do we begin to mount a challenge to some of the impacts of this movement, if indeed we all agree with it? These are just my thoughts, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts as well. But one thing I think is important is to understand historical context. And what I mean by this is to understand the religious history of this country as it relates to American Protestantism. The Christian tradition has an entire branch of study known as eschatology, which means it's just a fancy theological term for the study of the end times and of Jesus' return. Christians who are creedal and recite creeds as part of their worship all recite a belief that Jesus will return again, and he will return to usher in God's kingdom on earth. The conundrum and the challenge for the Christian tradition is that clearly the early church, reflected in the New Testament, anticipated that this return would be imminent and would be happening at any moment. And we're 2,000 years past that and no return of Jesus. And so the tradition has struggled to articulate a central belief that the scriptures record that Jesus says, I will come again. And Jesus hasn't shown up. So what do we do with that? For most of the movement up through the 19th century, the idea is an interpretation of the book of Revelation that what's described as the 1,000-year reign of God that will culminate in Jesus' kind of final triumph is the responsibility of Christians to bring about. And they do that by working to build the structures that reflect Christian commitments to compassion and hospitality, to build, at least from their understandings, what would look like a charitable society grounded in care for other human beings. That framework was absolutely core and essential for a movement in the early years of the 20th century known as the social gospel, that I would argue is the precursor that makes this building, this program, and this course of study that you're in possible. If the social gospel had not happened a century ago, and if John Rockefeller had not pumped the equivalent of billions of dollars of his own fortune into public health movements that were just emerging in the early decades of the 20th century, the infrastructure that creates the modern public health and especially global health movement will not exist in 2025. And so we are heirs to a certain kind of legacy of the understanding within Christianity of what it means to have a responsibility to usher in God's kingdom. I'm not saying you have to be a Christian to believe that. I'm saying that Christians who articulated and acted out of that religious belief a century ago set into place the structures of the field that you're part of today. New apostolic religion movement, New apostolic reformation movement operates with a very different understanding of eschatology, what's known as a premillennial eschatology. And that is that Jesus will not return without a final battle between good and evil that will be cosmic and cataclysmic in regard to the structures and institutions of society globally. And Jesus will marshal the forces of good over and against, long described in the Christian scriptures as the Antichrist, who will marshal forces against God's will and against the kingdom of God. And that a battle will take place, an actual literal war will take place, and that war will happen before the 1,000-year reign. And the 1,000-year reign of God, of Jesus' return, can only happen because of that war being fought and Jesus and his followers winning it. That religious network has a fundamentally different understanding of what's happening in 2025. And that understanding grounds a lot of their framework out of which they're operating. Some of my concerns about work that I've been doing for 15 years to forge networks, to create an infrastructure and a framework for support and collaboration between public health and faith actors, is that we work with that slice of the Christian tradition and of other religious traditions that were operating very much out of this kind of post-millennial mindset. The idea of ushering in God's reign through goodness and compassion, etc. But that framework exists and can be taken up for very different means and ends as it intersects with public health. This framework is a channel to operate directly within public health itself for movements such as NAR. I think it's really important, understanding that context, that we began to take this movement seriously and we study it from a public health perspective, not only to publish in peer-reviewed journals, but to inform action. I think it's important that we reinforce and actively support religious movements that don't look like this one. My guess is that many of you in this room were really excited to see Bishop Budd preach at the National Cathedral on the day of Trump's inauguration and plead with him to offer compassion to those most on the margins. My question to you is, how have you followed up with that? What have you done to actively support the religious tradition marked by that kind of framework and perspective, whether you're a person of faith or not, but from the point of view of cultural and political engagement in the civil fabric of the country? How can you support and give amplification of voice to those kind of perspectives and points of view? Similarly, how can those of us in a research university like Emory that both has a strong health sciences program and a really robust infrastructure for the study of religion, how can we integrate students in theological education coming out of all of our School of Theology, such as Chandler, or out of the doctoral program in the Graduate Division of Religion, into our work here, so that there's an intersection that is robust in terms of science and practice that reflects a certain kind of religious framework that is not that of NAR. And finally, this would need to happen from within religious communities themselves. But there exist inordinate numbers of bridging religious congregations, local communities, that stand in this intersection, that are largely white evangelical, Hispanic Protestant, or Black Protestant. They are tied into religious traditions that have long histories and have organizational structure. And the leaders of those congregations are struggling right now to understand what they see happening among their lay people, as more and more of their lay people are drawn to the kind of call of New Apostolic religious movement to rescue a country that has lost its religious mores in their point of view. And the New Apostolic Reformation presents a promise for how to re-anchor America to its Christian foundations and moorings. And if you articulate a kind of framework of what the implications of New Apostolic Reformation are for people who are sitting in pews each Sunday in those kinds of congregations, some of them may be right on board with that, but there will be numbers of them who will say, that's not what I mean by the idea that I want to reestablish Christian commitments in this country. I'm not calling for the creation of armed militias to police immigrant communities, which PRI is studying actually shows a correlation between NAR perspectives and support for movements such as that. For Black Protestants, the idea that NAR, which explicitly calls for decoupling the Christian tradition from social justice movements, for Black Protestants to hear that Christianity is not part and parcel of a call for God's justice to be made known in the world will stand in tension with the historical movement of the American Civil Rights Movement and will create a cognitive dissonance among the members of those local congregations and their religious communities. And those kind of dissonances need to be created and strengthened and amplified. And finally, I think it's important that we begin to identify and develop ways to organize that subset of the nuns who are not atheist or agnostic, but identify as spiritual but not religious, and they're probably a majority of the nuns, to organize them beyond kind of personal spiritual practice into some kind of engagement in the civic and social and political space. I myself, as someone who teaches Chandler students and Rollins students together in 2 courses, and I do that every year, I would say that the majority of students that I'm seeing for Candler these days are in that space. They've given up on denominational structures of mainline Protestantism. Many of them, not all, but many of them have. And they're working to find a place to organize and to create the commitments that they're tied to, including spiritual practice, into broader organizational and social structures. And I think efforts to support those efforts and to build that infrastructure could be important. Those are some of the places where I'm thinking about these days and starting to work around my efforts as an individual, both as a person of faith and someone working in public health in the religious space, to push back against some of the things that I see emerging out of this movement that are having a direct impact on programs and activities that I've been part of for the past 15 years. But you may have others, and I'd love to hear them. And so with that, I'll open it up for a general discussion and question and answer. Thank you very much. Number one, you can unmute and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat. Any questions or comments?
I wish there was an open bar here, especially as a minister and as somebody whose main appeal is nuns who are about to become nuns, because they've given religion one last chance with the Unitarian Universal. But when you said that there would be a cognitive dissonance among African American Protestants, I am very afraid that that's generation. And that for younger African Americans, they don't have to stop by the church house on any given day. They may, and the other movement has created something very attractive for them and hasn't exposed some of their racist notions. Do you have some suggestion, or do I need to find an open bar?
Well, you might need to look for an open bar, at least as one. You don't have to rely on one strategy alone. I think you're probably right. I do think that the resonance of such a position will be different for those in their 50s and older versus those from a younger generation. And as the kind of instinctive articulation of the dissonance across white evangelicalism would also have a different resonance for one generation versus another. So I'm not disagreeing with you. What I do wonder, though, is what the articulation and building an awareness of the implications, the social political implications of the movement, not the theological claim, because I don't think you'll create a dissonance by saying, we don't want America to be a Christian country, because a lot of people in those pews are going to say, yes, we do. It's my understanding of what Christianity is, and I want it to look like that. And they're going to articulate a certain set of assumptions embedded in that, or they may not even be able to articulate them. But what they would support is not what NARS do. That said, if you demonstrated how this movement is enacting policies and programs at federal and state levels that are contrary to the best interest of Black communities and Black individuals, even if they're not part of those Black Protestant congregations, even if they're not going to a National Progressive or National Baptist congregation on Sundays, they only go when they go to see grandma or at Christmas. They're going to be aware that some of them will be aware in their own social political context that this is a political movement that's grounded in a religion that they would fight back against. I think part of building the awareness in the Black community as a whole, which could happen through Black church structures, would be to amplify that message for those even who are not regularly attending religious services, including younger generation.
My fear is that Beyonce has far more influence than anybody with Reverend in front of them.
I'm not saying that that if we just do this work, Beyonce's influence will drastically drop, and our indicator for how we're doing at amplifying this message is to make Beyonce less popular. I am saying that engaging the various structures of local communities in their cultural context to illuminate what some of the implications of this movement are a necessary step for building coalitions to resist. Yeah.
John, thank you.
No worries. Go ahead. Go ahead. No, that's fine.
I have a few questions, but I'll just start with one. With the nuns, I know you mentioned like that there's some that like maybe atheist agnostic, but then others who like have just stepped away from the church. You know if there's any data on that or how many classify those categories? And I ask because as someone Grace has maybe more than normal understanding of the Bible. I'm wondering how many of those are just that they're not content with organized religion in the United States, and how much of fighting Christian nationalism might be speaking to the parts of it that don't align with the Bible. Just because and I know, so an illustration, I guess, is I did a lot of work with vaccines. And so there was the group of people, we also separated them into groups much like this one. And it was there was a group that we knew no matter what we told them, nothing's going to happen. So I didn't say anything. But then there was the group where it's hesitant, could be convinced one way or the other. And I wonder how much of that might be maybe convincing someone that actually the Bible contradicts kind of these movements, and how much room there might be.
Great question, and great series of questions. Breaking out the data in regard to the characteristics of those who identify as unaffiliated. There is some rather long-standing, longitudinal, and robust data in regard to that. And I don't have them off the top of my head, but last time I checked, a majority of those who self-identify as nuns do not also identify as atheist or agnostic. So most within that tradition express, and often it's expressed in that very term, that I'm spiritual but not religious. That they find some cognitive resonance with the idea that there's mystery beyond what we can know and ascertain through human reason alone, that there is something that they're comfortable speaking about in God language that literally exists, and that their lives are improved by seeking that mystery out and through spiritual practice. And they have very little interest in getting to that and understanding it through the structures of organized religion. Now, what you've also asked is something I've wondered about, and I've not seen any data on it, is the religious dissatisfaction of the nuns symptomatic of a rather social dissatisfaction with institutions in general, and this kind of new movement, especially of American young men, especially white men, moving into religious communities, indication of movements like NAR filling a certain kind of void in a way of understanding the world and of connecting into the world, that same cohort of young men 5 years ago may have been nuns, and today they're part of organized Christian communities. And that's a great question. I've wondered it myself, and I've not seen the data on it. Guksha.
Thank you very much. And as someone who comes from a totally different part of the world where things are even more mixed up, my question is, we have these intersections, right? However we call it, whether we call it spirituality, organized religion, what you think of as public health. Where do rights come in this? I know we sort of touched into this, right? Whether we call it human rights, whether we call it civil rights, or whoever rights, or is that off the table? And how does one navigate that? Because that's something. And the reason I'm bringing that up is, I guess there's a lot of generations that haven't done history. To me, as someone from a different thing, it's striking that this country was founded, at least the part that came from across the Atlantic, fleeing from religious persecution, and that we're at this stage. And that just blows my mind. But anyway, I wanted to bring it back to kind of that part of the rights.
It's a great question. Let me complicate the idea of the last speech she said and then turn to the question you asked about where does rights fit in. I don't disagree with the idea that the first white Europeans who came to this country did so motivated by religious freedom. They also were not motivated by an expansive understanding of that. The very first thing they did was that the Continental Congress did before we had a new nation, when we were a British colony, was to send a note of displeasure back to the British Parliament for its policing of religious freedom and liberty for Protestants in Great Britain and England at the time. The second thing they did was to send a note of displeasure to that same group for allowing Roman Catholics to gather in the Canadian colony, because the only ones who should be allowed to gather and worship were Protestants. And so their idea of religious freedom wasn't broad and expansive and universal. There was freedom for Protestants, as a minus. This for that, it's a free speech. In regard to human rights, and where does human rights fit into this? I think human rights is, and an appeal to human rights remains a really important and energizing kind of rhetoric in some context. I think there are religious roots or there are religious elements within the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and amplifying those in relation to the kind of religious movement we see within an AR could be helpful and powerful. I also think we need to multiply our perspectives, because there are many people sitting in the kinds of congregations I've named who have been told that an appeal to human rights is against their religious tradition. That it's not that it's irrelevant or it's something that's fine, it's that it is ungodly. And so an appeal to human rights alone won't win the day, but I don't think we should give up.
Sorry, just a quick comment on that, because I do like with ties like others. Oh.
Yeah, see me afterwards.
Yeah.
I had a question about this idea of like a stalled nuns or like plateau. In one of the graphs you showed, I'm not sure if you can go back to it, but there was a long period, maybe in like the 80s or 90s, that we saw a similar plateau in the number of the nuns rising. So it was like kind of like rise, long plateau, and then it rose again. And I don't know if you have any context for why there was this plateau for a while, but maybe that history speaks also to what we might anticipate seeing.
Yeah, it's a good question. When Pew first began to note that the percentages of those who identify as unaffiliated had stalled or even started to drop last year, they noted that in 2016 there had been a similar 2-point drop. The drop last year is 3 points. They noted a similar 2-point drop. And so they asked that question, and they said it's too early to know. This just could be statistical noise. The study that just came out by Pew today, that was in the New York Times data, gives a second data point that something may actually have shifted. And looking at the kind of religious landscape, what may have shifted is this increase in participation in these very conservative leaders. I think it's too soon to know. Yeah. And if this movement doesn't continue to, if it doesn't develop enough force on its own to perpetuate and to generate windy eras and to argue for and build excision, it could die out on its own. But you just move that's how religious or this movements work. Stick around. Okay.
Just very briefly, I know you mentioned that a group of interest, which were the people that were born religious or were religious during their childhood, but then later on are either they haven't yet fully given up, but they're kind of on their verge, or this is their last strike. Are there any indicators for what reasons are behind that last, like, this is my last time trying to be religious? Is it because of social issues or structural factors or still beliefs, or kind of what would lead someone to say that this is the last time that I'm trying this out?
There is some data, especially among young women, that it is a sense of kind of giving up on religious structures in relation to commitments and self-understandings that women feel for themselves as to who they are, what leads to the class. So, for example, among the young adult women, the percentage you self-identify as feminist is now over 60%, the highest it's ever been in any age cohort since that question's been asked. And for members, especially of evangelical traditions, who are part of communities that say women are fundamentally subservient to men in terms of leadership roles because that's about the design, there's a disconnect between their own self-understanding and commitments culturally and what they're hearing in their religious communities. I think a lot of, and this is anecdotal, that data we've got. My own anecdotal experiences is that many who are students who come to seminary at a place like Emory are deeply, deeply motivated by religious experience and religious commitments. They just are disillusioned with the organizational structure of Christian communities, and they think, and many of them are opting for looking for ways to create careers and opportunities professionally and vocationally to live out that commitment outside of the structure of religious denominations. So there's all kinds of factors and forces at play. Now we're out of time. I'm happy to keep the discussions with online in the room for those who are here. And if you're online and you wanted to ask a question of me, feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you all so much for coming today and participating in this lecture.